Hi, this is Owen Larson with the Professor Podcast, the podcast of your professors, their research, and their academic lives here at St. Thomas. This week, we are delighted to have Dr. Alexis Easley, Chair of the Communications and English Department here at St. Thomas. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
How are you
Delighted
doing?
to be here.
Yeah. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing quite well. It's a beautiful summer's day.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Been up to anything recently?
Well, I was in France for 3 weeks.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, I was there for a conference, but also just traveling around. Yeah, I've been an Anglophile for so long, I feel like I might become a Francophile.
Well, that's fun. I mean, obviously you're in the English studies sort of concentration department. How long have you been with St. Thomas?
So I've taught at St. Thomas since 2005, so a good long while. I've been department chair for just less than a month.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So, with your time at St. Thomas and studying in the communications and English sort of area, and you've been able to lead your research in that area as well, one of the topics that you've been really researching has been scrapbooking.
Yes.
Yes. So, in sort of layman's terms, how would you define scrapbooking? Because it's a very, big concept.
Yeah.
So, what would you say it is?
Well, I first got interested in scrapbooks when I was with a couple of graduate students on a trip abroad in the UK. And I knew that there was this incredible collection of Victorian scrapbooks at Manchester Metropolitan University. So I thought, hey, let's go up and have a look at those. And we were amazed by what they had. Nearly 300 of these vintage, one-of-a-kind works of art created by largely Victorian women anonymously during the 19th century. So as we started leafing through them, we just thought this is such a rich repository of art and of documentation of how women read. So that really sparked my imagination and my two graduate students as well. And gave some conference presentations after that and published a couple of articles. And now I'm getting ready to publish a facsimile of one of these scrapbooks, which is going to come out from Routledge, I think, in the spring.
Wow.
Yeah.
And when we talk about scrapbooks in the Victorian era is a bit different than what, you might define as scrapbooking that might happen now.
Yes.
What is that difference?
So before the 19th century, people kept friendship albums and commonplace books. And a commonplace book is just where, as part of your reading, you would just write down like important quotes or ideas, just handwritten. And then friendship albums were created in friendship groups where you would just like get people to write a little signature or put a poem in there or something like that. So it's very social. What happens in 1825 is the term scrapbook is coined, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, and it really marks an important new media moment because it was really during the 1820s and 1830s that you have the first notion of mass media, because there were a whole bunch of taxes on print, and all of a sudden they were lifted, and there were tons of cheap periodicals being published. So instead of people just handwriting things in these books, now they were cutting and pasting from cheap periodicals. And if you look at the example on the screen, for example, you can see that these are cut, like physically cut from magazines and newspapers. So it was a way of kind of a media assemblage, really, of just various things that you read in the popular print of the time. So it's what distinguished a scrapbook from those earlier models. And today, of course, people use a lot of photography. They use a lot of purchased borders and images and create their scrapbooks that way. But it's part of the same tradition. And I think it's important for people who do scrapbooking now to realize it has this long history, this long, rich history. And one of the other aspects of this 1825 moment that I want to draw attention to is just like now we're overwhelmed by media. Now it's more digital media than print. In those days, they were similarly overwhelmed. It's like, what do I do with all these poems, all this information, all these articles? How do I make sense of them for myself? And on social media, we do this all the time. We share, we post, like ones that are important to us. In this period, it was, okay, I'm going to take all this material, I'm going to call out those things that are meaningful to me, put them in one place, like you see here on the screen. May or may not be related to each other, these poems and paragraphs. But for me, it's a way of making sense of what otherwise would be overwhelming amount of information.
Yeah, so it's sort of in a way cataloging the lives and experiences that a lot of these Victorian women went through.
Yeah, and it really blurs the line between authorship, consumption, and kind of creation, sort of just artistic creation. So it's, which is it? If you're simply just cutting and pasting things and rearranging them on the page, as you see here, what do you call that? And I think that this is, I think, very familiar to all of us as 21st century folks, because we are always, kind of like creating and authoring based on materials that we cull from other places, whether it's on Pinterest, whether it's on Facebook or TikTok. We're always creating these media assemblages. So I think we can relate to what the Victorians were up to.
Yeah, a scrapbook might, in a way, be a sort of like favorites kind of tab or something like that. Did you see that a lot of these scrapbooks really, took the personality of the person that was creating them and really, put it onto the page that way?
Yeah, it's so interesting that's an interesting question, because on one hand, you might look at a page like this and think, oh, there's a theme here, there's a persona that pulls all this together. But I'd say 99% of scrapbooks are anonymous, so we have no access to the person who created them. So we can't look up through Ancestry or other sources, like where they lived even, or their socioeconomic status or anything. So all we have is what's on the page. And we can begin, by researching where these scraps came from, we can get a sense of the persona that created them and what sorts of things they were interested in. I'll show you some examples of this later. But a lot of it's guesswork. But one of the things I did after I discovered these scrapbooks is I started to, using databases that we have access to here at St. Thomas, I would type keywords into the databases to try to find out where they sourced these scraps. And I was not always successful, but sometimes I was able to find them. So that was really helpful in understanding, what they read, because oftentimes they'll take off the dates and even the authors for things that they cut out. But you can restore that by doing this research and figure out, what did they read? Where did they get these? And to me, that is, from a women's history perspective, is so helpful, because it's a mystery how people read or what they read. And we know the publications that came out, but it's how did they read them? What did they find significant? A scrapbook tells you that if you delve into the details of where the materials came from.
Yeah, and something I think is especially interesting is that a lot of these scrapbooks were not necessarily made, to be read or understood by others. Mm-hmm. And so to the person who's putting it together, they don't need, the extra information kind of thing. How does maybe the privacy of the scrapbook change, how the information's laid out, how it's displayed, and what eventually we see now?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And, they were meant to be consumed in a private space. And the people who were the intended readers were family members, generally friends. They weren't meant to be preserved, generally. Although, thank goodness, some families had the sense to keep them in their attics. And the person who created the collection at Manchester Metropolitan University was a collector who just went from bookstore to bookstore, looking for these one-of-a-kind albums that survived. But yeah, it's really hard to recreate what the original setting would have been, except we can probably assume that they would sit in the parlor, maybe over a cup of tea and just share a laugh or as they read through these poems and shared them with each other. So there was definitely a social component to this that is interesting to think about. And some of the examples we'll see a bit later are interactive. So I think that's especially interesting because it implies that it isn't just a solo act, but you're hoping other people will pick this up and leaf through it and interact with some of the materials as they go through it.
So you talked about how it's a social act, And a lot of these scrapbooks are meant to, be shared, be shown off, be, exchanged with friends kind of thing. Was that a big, point to making these scrapbooks? Was the social element and being able to do something, that other people are also doing, that everyone can come together and then explore that all together?
Absolutely. And I think to put it in 21st century terms, kind of like maker culture or fan groups are very similar in this way or those who write fan fiction, for example, where they're interacting with media. They're not simply just reading or listening or viewing. They're like interacting with those materials in creative ways. And I think that is really fascinating. And during this time period, like our own time period, there's such a mechanization of popular culture. I mean, there are major corporations involved, and in the early Victorian period, there are all sorts of news organizations involved in producing content. And a scrapbook, just like other art forms, is a way to creatively respond to that which you're given. So you're not a passive consumer. You're an active creator in response to what you encounter in your world. So I love that idea. And as I've shared with you before, during the pandemic, a lot of people were talking about this. How can we, at home, do crafts and sort of use those as a basis of social life? And it really made me think about scrapbooks and the way that sometimes their creators were in remote locations, and this was their way of connecting with other people in their circle. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So these scrapbooks, you said were made by mostly women in the Victorian era. Think about, women's history around that time. Would you say that scrapbooks were a way for women to express themselves or, have, control over things that they are, given for content to consume, that sort of thing, to have their own spin on things?
Absolutely. I mean, there were a lot of women writing during this time period, which is another piece of my research to really look into who created the newspaper and periodical content during this time period. And there was a huge efflorescence of women's writing during this time period. So women were authoring during this time period, but not everyone really had an inclination that way. So a lot of other people, repurposed writing that was published in very creative ways. And some of the examples I'll show you in a little bit really highlight the kinds of themes that they created, the ways that they combine material culture with print culture to convey important messages about their lives. And some of them are downright resistant to master narratives in their culture. So it's a place to look for resistance to kind of oppressive social strictures as well. So you really have to read deeply to see these messages, but they're absolutely there, and it's really exciting. It's like other art forms associated with women's domestic culture, like needlework or quilting. There's so much more there than just a decorative art. There are messages that can be discerned by those who are willing to look closely.
That's a really, really great point. A lot of the scrapbooking that you've shown us has a lot of similarities, I'd say, to social media pages, and that's something that you've talked about in some of your research, is that there is a mix of images with text, with other forms of stuff that you can see now in social media sites like Pinterest or Instagram or other kind of ways that you can curate your own content. What do what is that similarity like? And do you think that's like a common thread among people that need to have sort of control over, what's given?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I want to remind everyone is that the metaphors that we use in social media, cutting, pasting, pinning, posting, those all come from print culture. It's like taking a print culture, kind of process and using it metaphorically in our current digital media. So I think that in itself shows you that there's a close tie between these earlier print engagements and our current digital ones. So that to me is a really important thing to remember about this process. One huge difference between digital scrap collection and physical scrap collection is the haptics of it. And that term haptic might not be familiar, but it's just like the sensory, like touch quality of a piece of writing. These are original, one-of-a-kind scrapbooks, and they'll often have like things in them like needlework or even the way that the scraps overlap with each other. There's a touch quality to it that unfortunately you can't get from a digital slide like this one. But if you go to Manchester Metropolitan University, as I did, you sort of like realize that the paper has different weights depending on which one it is, different covers, so that's lost in a digital environment, that haptic aspect of scrapbooking.
Yeah. Thank you. I was going to ask about, the materials and how these scrapbooks were put together, because I'm going to assume that obviously not everything is uniform. Like you said, there's needleworking, there's, other types of, ways that these pages are put together. What is that difference like between piece to piece?
Yeah, maybe this would be a good time for me to show some pages. Would you like me to do that?
Of course.
Okay. Like the one you see here on the screen, you can see that the author of this page was really trying to just maximize every corner. So there really isn't much of a margin around any of these pieces. When I did research on this particular page, I realized that a lot of these scraps were from the 1830s. So that was most of these are undated, so this was helpful to know when this was published. And most of these scraps have nothing to do with each other. They seem to have just been things that were important, and they were just like squished onto a page. But you do find echoes in themes. Like on the left-hand side here, this poem is about death. And on the other side, The Stranger by Barry Cornwall, which I identified from 1832, also reflects on that theme. So there are some thematic threads that the writer is interested, or the author is interested in tracing here. But mostly it's just a collage-like structure. And I wanted to point out just the interactive quality of these. This is I think also from John Ryland's University. But you can see that in order to read this particular article, you have to like lift up a little piece. So again, that interactive haptic quality is really important to take note of.
It's not meant to be flat.
Yes, right. Yeah, so a digital slide doesn't quite capture it. So this is an example from an 1834 scrapbook from the Harry Page collection, which I found just absolutely remarkable. So all of the diagonal pieces you see here are from a column in the Morning Post, which was a newspaper of the 1820s. The column was called The Fashionable World. So this person just thought these little jokes, these little funny sayings would be fun to cut out and arrange. But most of the rest of the page seems to be just there for decorative purposes. So there's always this interesting tension between just making a beautiful page that's fun to look at and one that has interesting themes or kind of threads that could be connected. And I wanted to show here on the left side of the screen here, like where these were sourced. And one of the other interesting things I discovered about this page was that I don't know if you can see this, but there are little borders, cut-out borders around all the diagonal snippets. And I think that's such an interesting move on the scrapbook creator's part to kind of enshrine something that is by definition quite throwawayable. And most people would see a newspaper scrap as just something to throw into the fire, during this time period. So it's kind of enshrines them and sort of like draws attention to their importance.
Yeah. And that decorative cutting that we see here is probably what a lot of people think of scrapbooking, more and more recently is, pictures with decorative cutouts, with different frames, all that sort of stuff is happening here.
And during this time period, in addition to the press just going crazy, I mean, just like there's so many new publications, That's also true of visual culture during this time period. As many accounts describe a trip to London as just like posters everywhere. Like everything is covered with advertisements and posters. So it's, and then in periodicals, their technology of creating illustration is also really improving immensely. So there's a lot more visual material, comics, portraits, landscapes that you can source for your scrapbook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people often forget that even before photography became cheaper, and periodicals and newspapers began to use those over other methods, that it wasn't entirely just a textual medium. It's had visual quality, and it had other sort of depictions, and you see those here in these scrapbooks.
Yeah, absolutely. Woodcuts were especially popular during this early time period. But advertisements were everywhere. And one of the scrapbooks I'll show you in a few minutes is just like repurposing images from a lot of advertisements. But I wanted to share this one, which I think is really quite remarkable. So this poem was sourced from 1854. So this is a slightly later example. And what she does, and we actually have a name for this one. This is Anne Wharton Stock. Was a real person. Found out she was the daughter of a magistrate in southeast England. So this is extremely rare to find the name of a person. But anyway, she loved this poem clearly, which is Gerald Massey's That Mary, Mary May, so much that she created this elaborate pencil border for it, which I think is quite remarkable. I mean, it's really quite intricate and beautiful. And it once draws attention to just how ephemeral the scrap of the poem is. It's like her art seems so over the top compared to this seemingly unimportant piece of newspaper poetry, but she enshrines it and sort of makes it something much more important and beautiful. Obviously really deeply meaningful to her, otherwise she wouldn't put in the time.
Yeah, and you talked earlier about how a lot of this scrapbooking is similar to social media sites, and you could almost consider this a fan work or an idea sprung from the poem, drawing inspiration, taking something that's given and then changing it or adding your own to it. And you see that right here with the drawing.
Yeah, it's a very good example of that. And on the one side of the screen, I show you where the poem actually came from. And this poem was published in lots of different places, as was practice of the day. But I could tell this was where she got it because there are particular typographical features that this particular newspaper has. So another point I'll make about this particular page is I actually have been in touch with her descendants, Anne Wharton Stock, via Ancestry.com. But so far they haven't responded to me. But I'm like, do you realize your ancestor has this incredible scrapbook? You need to go and look at it. But anyway, that's a rare one. This is another one of my favorites. I love this one. It's just visually stunning. And I love how this creator put all these little bugs. He's cut out bugs in addition to poetry and images of Normandy women in traditional costume. So when I investigated these scraps, one of the things I discovered is that they all, in one way or another, reflect on women's roles. And some of them depict women as being very superficial. Other ones kind of point to women's depth and sort of their non-material qualities. So it's an interesting, I think, meditation on women's roles in 19th century society. This is from 1820s, 30s. Yeah.
Yeah, especially since, a lot of the qualities that some of these scrapbooks are trying to, explore, they have to come from material itself. Different texts, different images, different drawings. That it's the idea of trying to take something like an emotion, a feeling, the ideas, and putting them into something that is more representative. And that's what you see a lot of these scrapbooks have, a lot of symbolism. Would you agree?
Yes. The insects here, I think, in some ways could symbolize kind of the ephemerality of individual existence. There are lots of ways you could read it. But as you were speaking, I was thinking, too, that many of us are familiar with the idea of kind of an idea board. And in many ways, that's a way to see this, too. It's a way like, oh, I'm interested in this and this creatively, and what happens synergistically when I put these favorite images and poems together. Yeah, so I'm fascinated by that. And the other thing that's significant here with this page is the way that it violates the horizontal vertical axes of print. Because normally, you have columns of print in newspapers and periodicals, but I love how she just plays with that, saying, hey, this is a scrapbook, I don't have to conform. Mm-hmm. And like just creating this wonderful kind of visual pleasure for those who might have a look at it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So you mentioned that this was a craft that a lot of women partook in. What was the opinion of Victorian men around this area of scrapbooking?
Yeah, it was so commonplace, as part of everyday middle and upper class life that there isn't a whole lot of commenting on it. However, there were lots of companies involved in producing commercial scrapbooks. And there was some discussion of scrap services at the latter part of the century, where it's like, let's say you're interested in soccer. You could hire this scrap seeking company to find you a whole bunch of scraps that you could include. And it's important to note too that the scrapbook is contemporaneous with periodicals that did very similar things. They would reprint from other magazines and periodicals, usually without permission. And so they would create their own assemblages. So it was like scrapbooking, but it was in the form of a periodical or newspaper. So it's a complementary practice to scrapbooking. So a lot of men were involved in that, obviously sub-editors of magazines and periodicals. And women were had this mirror obsession with collecting scraps. The commonplace book, which precedes the scrapbook, there were a lot of men creating those. So it's interesting that it becomes gendered as you get to the 19th century.
That's a really good point. Yeah. So in the scrapbooks that you've been researching and you've seen, and the role of these women in these scrapbooks and taking pieces of what they can find and then putting them together and artistically arranging them, do you see family interaction in that, of mothers and daughters or sisters or other family members interacting, sharing, or creating separate scrapbooks but mirroring each other?
Yeah, I haven't found any family with more than one yet, but I'm sure they exist. But this scrapbook that I'll show you here, this is by someone named MAC, just initials. But on the spine of the scrapbook are different initials. So it was like WMW or something like that. So I speculate that it might have been begun by a mother, aunt, sister, and then MAC sort of picks it up from there. But there are all sorts of tantalizing connections here, like this first page that you see here of a portrait. Is this a self-portrait? Is this a portrait of a friend? It's really hard to say, but I love how meta it is. It's because it has, the ink, and the paintbrush, which kind of draws attention to the fact that she's actually decorating pages as well with these very instruments. So I love that. The other example from her scrapbook that I have here, it has what you see in the upper right-hand corner there is actually a box of needles, with needles in them. So that's the title of the page, is Needles. And the excerpted passage in the middle is an article about by a very famous woman writer named Harriet Martineau about the needle industry and women's involvement in that industry. So it's this really interesting page. And then all of that is surrounded by these muses, so it's taking the whole idea of needle making and kind of elevating it. So she's doing something really interesting there. Mm-hmm. But on the next page, just to answer your question more directly, down here on the bottom left, you see an actual sampler that she ascribes to a particular person. I'm trying to remember what her name was. I can't remember right now, but she says, this is so-and-so's sampler. And it's again, haptic. I mean, it's literally an embroidered piece that's included in the scrapbook. So there were instances like that where you see her incorporating other members of her circle. But they're just tantalizing details, and it's hard to, since I don't know who she was, to figure out who she's speaking of and to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the interesting thing is that within these scrapbooks, the pages know who's creating them.
Mm-hmm.
The people who, would see these scrapbooks, they'd understand.
Yes.
And that's such an interesting part.
Yeah, so you can understand it, but only to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true of so much of what remains of the historical record. There are always as many mysteries, even in something that seems, really straightforward, like a novel.
Mm-hmm.
You think you know everything, the whole story, but then once you kind of get into the research, you realize that there are all sorts of unanswered questions about this piece. But scrapbooks really highlight that, what's noble, what isn't.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side of this slide here, I think is a really wonderful page. This is the same one by MAC. But she has this little window that you sort of open up, and it has this name Melanie written on it. It could be her, right? MAC could be Melanie something. but it has like just very cryptic kind of quotes on it too. So it's like, whoever in the family circle or friend circle opened this knew what those reference, but for a modern reader, we just have to guess. But it's those guesses that I find just absolutely enjoyable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If it were easy to figure out, it wouldn't be a work of art, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a big part of art is, the author, the artist lets you in a certain amount, but the rest you either have to explore or leave, And obviously with any sort of personal work that's not entirely meant for a large audience, you're going to lose things like nicknames or, personal references, inside jokes. Those sorts of things are going to be lost, but they were meant to be understood by perhaps the audience it was being created for. And that's really interesting seeing these pieces 150, 200 years afterwards.
Exactly. And what we gain is a sense of what everyday people, were interested in, and, how they read print culture, and, what they found beautiful. We like to think that readers in the past, loved the same poets that we love, for example. But if you read through scrapbooks, you realize that, what we would consider kind of sentimental verse or like throwaway verse of the Victorian period was like really important to them, much in the way that popular music is now, So it helps to align, our thinking about what people actually read and what they actually enjoyed and thought was funny, which is hard to access in other media. So that scrapbooks are really great for that.
Yeah. And you also see the perspective of women, where oftentimes that perspective gets lost to history. But in these scrapbooks, you see, what stories, what parts of, poems, what sort of things that really, impacted them.
Yeah, and it was during this time period, sort of 1820s on forward, that women became a major audience of print. I think one scholar estimated that between 1880 and 1900, there were 121 periodicals founded for women specifically, and that had prehistory as well. So it's like all of a sudden women are targets for print and advertisements, and so therefore, they're kind of constructing women, and women are kind of constructing themselves in response through scrapbooking. And I'll just give you another couple of examples of this. This is from the Winterthur Library. I love this one so much. It's called a paper doll album. You can see that it takes images from advertising for fashions and sort of puts them into a domestic space. And what I love, the green part you see on the slide there, is a piece of wallpaper, actually. So there's something very meta about that. It's like, all right, I'm going to take material, like physical materials from my parlor and repurpose them into this imagined parlor. So it's wonderfully playful, just wonderful and just delightful to look at. And this other example, this is an example of photo collage. It's a whole subgenre of scrapbooks. And what they would do is they create these fanciful paintings like the one you see here. I mean, really skillful painting too.
Yeah.
And then take photographs of their friends and relatives and put them on these creatures' bodies, just for a laugh, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's supposed to be funny.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, once again, like the people featured in these photos were probably consumers of this scrapbook,
Mm-hmm.
and probably thought it was hilarious.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of these pictures have some sort of, a lot of these scrapbook pieces have a lot of manipulation techniques, but they didn't have, computers, they didn't have Photoshop.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of materials were they using to actually adhere these pieces together and change them, manipulate them? How are they doing that?
Yeah, so they had various types of paste that were just commercially available that they used to literally cut and paste. The photography materials don't become available really until the second half of the century, because photography was invented, in the 1840s, but it wasn't commercially, viable until later. So you can kind of tell what period a scrapbook is from, and partly because of the materials that they use, and like the commercially produced scraps, those are also largely later in the century, so you can date them that way. But the next scrapbook that I want to show you is it's very specifically focused on repurposing advertising scraps. Do you want me to show it
Yeah.
to you? Okay. Yeah, so this is the one that's the subject of the facsimile edition that I'm creating for Routledge. And it's composed of 4 narratives with some, what I'm calling vignettes, interspersed between these 4 narratives. So each narrative, tells a satirical story. And the way that she does it is, you can see at the very bottom of the page that she has kind of a running narrative, and that goes throughout. So it's really a precursor to like a graphic novel,
Yeah, yeah. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Was this how widespread were these sorts of examples of almost narratives being built? Well, not almost, but narratives being built through these scrapbooks.
I think this is the only example I've seen.
Oh, wow.
Even though there are many, many manuscript books where you can tell it's original poetry, that they're, juxtaposing with printed scraps and illustrations and drawings. But yeah, this is why I wanted to create the facsimile edition of this one, because it was so unique and just so brilliant. I mean, it's wickedly funny. I mean, it's so funny.
There's so much creativity here in this piece. I mean, it's the art styles are slightly different between each of the scraps, but it's so cohesive. It works so well.
Yeah. Yeah, the composition is just fantastic. In this particular page, you can source every one of these illustrations to an advertisement. In this case, for furniture, children's clothing. And I love how she takes those, she cuts them out so precisely, and then puts them into a 3-dimensional space with perspective, by creating lines to show where the floor is, and also, kind of going back into space and sort of putting smaller objects in the back, larger ones in the front, to create that sense of 3-dimensionality, which is so cool.
Yeah.
And it evokes other kinds of media of the time, like stages. I mean, so there are lots of pages that remind me of stage sets. So I think she might have been evoking those as well in her design. But I really, I love this page in particular because I was able to find the source of the baby that you see in the bed there. Oh, wait, actually, it's this baby. This baby. This is, by the way, part of a story about this couple that they grew up as next-door neighbors. And it starts from when they're babies to when they get married. So it tells the whole story of their romance. So it's kind of also fitting into that kind of domestic novel kind of genre of the time period. Okay, so anyway, here's the image of the baby. You can see there under the blue canopy. And then here's where I've sourced the image. You can see how it's been cut out and placed into this bed by the creator. And what I think is so wonderful is that the text that goes along with her scrapbook page calls them like the best babies anyone has ever seen. You know, the two who are the subjects of this story. And it kind of echoes advertising language, like the very best, baby clothes you can buy, So she's playing off the language of advertising throughout just to make jokes.
Yeah, it's almost it's almost ironic in a way, or it takes that sort of serious advertising speak and then converts it into, okay, well, this is marketed at me, I'm going to do something with it.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Because I think too often people think that we're all just like victims of advertising, and they definitely thought that at the end of the 19th century. That's sort of like, oh, that's like barrage with ads all the time. And the assumption was that women, especially, just uncritically consumed the visual pleasures of those ads. But this scrapbook shows at least one woman who was like, thought there was a lot of material to spoof here. And if you look at this next page, throughout this story of these two, Thomas and Polly's romance, is like references to commercial culture. Both of their parents are in the advertising industry, and Tom's father runs a cocoa business, Epps Cocoa. Ironically, this image of a cocoa bean comes from a Fry's Cocoa ad of the same time period. So she's like making a joke that it doesn't really matter what the name of the company is. So the father who created this, according to her scrapbook, was going to create a 6-foot-long advertisement based on this cocoa bean for his company. And that references like all these huge advertisements that were everywhere in Victorian culture. Some of them pulled on wagons, some of them on the sides of buildings. So she's really drawing attention to that. So here's where this was sourced. And I love how she like takes the cocoa bean out, then she takes all the little advertising slogans and she puts them in this array around them. It completely changes the composition, and I think draws attention to its sensationalism and just sort of ridiculousness. So that's the first narrative. So the marriage plot is always intricately connected to the advertising plot. And throughout, it suggests that marriage is just another kind of commercial arrangement, just like commercial culture is constantly calling out people's relationships with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. That there's these images and these phrases not meant to be taken and changed, are being changed here and are being used for a personal use, and it's not for the company anymore, it's for this narrative that she's creating.
That's right. So it's anti kind of commercial culture in that regard. After all, she's making a unique, one-of-a-kind scrapbook here too, which kind of works against the idea of mass-produced visual and print culture. So I love all those layers of irony that you're drawing attention to. And I'll show you. This is just a couple of pages from the second one. So this is called Mr. Brown's Adventures in Search of a Wife, and he is a widower, and he's gone to a seaside resort to try to find a wife. And on this page, he sort of recounts like all the types of women he might be interested in, like the studious one, the beautiful one, and I think this idea of like types is so interesting. It's sort of like, because advertising culture like gives you like all these ways to be a woman, then and now, right? Like you can be this type or that type, and so she's really drawing attention to just how ridiculous that is. That would be his method of finding a spouse, and then he finds a woman he's interested in named Fanny. And he tries to woo her like with these really ridiculous gifts that you see at the top. Like there's a brooch that has rats on it, and there's like a pig charm. So it's like, and he professionally is a bootmaker. So once his object of desire finds someone else to marry, he gives them boots as a wedding present. There's the boots. And then it sort of goes on and on about all the other presents that other people give this couple, including vegetable seeds, which you see here, which is meant to be ridiculous. The vegetable seeds I traced to a men's newspaper, actually. So women weren't the only ones being barraged with, images from advertising. And then I love this one so much. This is next in the sequence. It says, a few friends with original minds gave the happy couple clocks,
Oh.
So it's just like, how unoriginal can you possibly be? So, and I love how this page, has duplicates, of some of the same advertising images. So this is really drawing attention to the fact that during this time period in newspapers and periodicals, like weddings were huge. And like buying gifts for weddings, there are ads everywhere. And for celebrity or fashionable weddings, they would have long lists of like all the gifts that the couple got. So here I think she's drawing attention to, again, the commercialization of marriage itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. And the surprising thing is that it's so funny. It's really funny. It's so creative, and it tells the story so succinctly, and just from the short bits of text that I've been able to read, it's got a very, very good knack at humor.
Yes.
That's so interesting to see that all of this is being created, with existing material taken out of its context and placed into the author's own.
And really, there's such critical thinking that you see here, that somebody isn't just passively consuming, what is offered to her, but she's like really thinking critically about it. And I think must have had a group of friends who all thought this was hilarious and were just like reading this together. So I think it's really heartening to me, as a scholar and also as a woman, that then and now, we don't have to passively consume the images that are given to us about how women should dress, what kinds of wedding gifts they should expect, et cetera, then it's all a little bit ridiculous. So interspersed between these four narratives are what I'm calling vignettes, which are just these one-page, one-offs that are kind of visual jokes, many of them, like this one, which is titled Affliction, ! Again, like I think that exclamation point drawing attention to kind of the hyperbole of advertising culture. And the text of this reads, one friend saying to the others, "How nice you all look." And they're all grieving, okay? Somebody has died. Which, after all, is the general, or the greatest matter in mourning, is to look good. Is what is conveyed here. It doesn't, the death, whatever. Just so you look good. And it actually mentions a place where you can buy mourning attire, if you're bereaved. So it's just really kind of making funny of just the superficiality of commercial culture there. And then it takes a serious turn with this vignette, which I find just kind of heartbreaking. It's called Maternal Affection. That's the title of it. And the woman who faces you there is the upper-class mother who supervises the governess whose back is turned to you here. And the lady of the house says, "I'm sure you don't mind, Mrs. Hunter," the governess, taking care of my little girl, Mary. She has scarlet fever. And then the text reads, that the lady of the house doesn't realize or doesn't care that Mrs. Hunter actually has 5 children at home. So she's like exposing her to scarlet fever that she's then going to take home to her children. So there's like this harsher kind of message in places about the class system, which I think is amazing.
And this is all within one book.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much material here, commenting on advertising, but also on class culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's extremely profound because you can see these images put together, and at first glance, it barely even looks like it's, from different types of images, different illustration styles, just because it's so cleanly put together, and it really just puts the reader into position where you are reading this not as advertisements clipped together, but you are reading this as its own story. And that's so wonderful.
It is. It's really astonishing. And like if you look at this page, a lot of these images were, well, all of them were from advertisements of the period, which would have been familiar to everybody of the time period, right? You wouldn't see them together in this particular composition, but you'd be like, oh yeah, I saw that chair and the ad for Harrods, or that dress. Yeah, I saw that in the ladies' magazine. But they're recombined. It's the recombination of these familiar images that really impacts the viewer. And I'm really glad that you mentioned the viewer, because I think in this instance, are we looking at a stage, when we see a scene like this? Or are we looking at kind of a predecessor of the graphic novel? Are we looking at a shop window? I think our role as readers is really kind of ambiguous and interesting for all of these. So I want to show you this one too. This is one of my favorites. This is also a vignette, not part of one of the 4 stories, but the text of this says, "Oh, what shall we do? Happy thought. Let's go look at the shops." And there's something so empty and vacuous about that statement, because they're sort of all heading different directions. They're idle. They have nothing to do. And many of the vignettes are about that, just sort of the idleness of upper class life. Everybody just sort of sits around. They go shopping. They look, hairstyles, So it feels, it's definitely meant to feel kind of vacuous and empty, this commercial culture. It isn't about relationships or love or, the things that people should care about.
Yeah, it's such a commentary on the daily life, which we see in this specific example, but also through all the other scrapbooks. Is just how these people live their lives and how they go about, how they go about seeing what brings them happiness, what they would like to see, what they do see unintentionally, and then they remark about. It's all there. It's all reflected.
I mean, I think maybe 50 years from now, people will look back at our social media with the same kind of viewpoint, thinking, oh, wow, what did the average person think about or care about or think was funny? I think, that our materials that we leave behind will be read in such a way. And there'll be certain examples like this that will sort of jump out as like, wow, that goes beyond just recording daily life. It's like a work of art. Yeah. The last narrative I want to draw your attention to from this facsimile edition that I'm getting ready to publish is, so this last one is about a pair of sisters who both want to redecorate their homes. So it's kind of going from fashion to home decoration in this last one. And during this time period after 1853, when Japan opened to the West, everybody wanted to decorate with Japanese furniture, painting, colors, design, so much so that there were major companies that reproduced Japanese furnishings and so on that people could buy for their homes. But anyway, it was a craze. There's no other way to describe it. The Mikado, which is a musical, also came out in 1885, and that sort of solidified the craze. So anyway, there are these 2 sisters. They both want to redesign their houses according to the latest Japanese design craze. Only one of them is successful, and it's hilarious because it's meant to be absolutely ridiculous, like how far they go. Like this page describes the garden, and you can see it's spilling out into the city because there's St. Paul's Cathedral of London, like Christopher Wren's masterpiece there in the background. And she refers to it as a perfect nuisance because it's interrupting the design of her Japanese-inspired garden. That's the text that goes with this image. But I think it's a stunningly designed page. I mean, it's like, at the same time, it's criticizing, Japanese craze in art decoration during this time period. It kind of replicates, like, its exquisiteness. And you really see that on this next one. I mean, it's like, just, I think, visually stunning. What she's created here. I mean, this particular narrative reiterates all sorts of stereotypes about Japanese culture, which is offensive, and I draw attention to in my introduction. But really, the point here is to draw attention to the process of cultural appropriation and how that can go terribly wrong. If you take wholesale someone else's design ideas and bring it to the UK. Uncritically, that it can just create comedy. So it's really, that's what this 4th narrative is all about. Yeah. So in the end, the sister creates this parlor that everyone in the family finds uncomfortable and unaesthetic. So it has kind of a negative ending. So anyway, that's my last slide, and that just gives you a taste of incredible diversity and richness of this field.
Mm-hmm.
And I really want to go back to Manchester to dig in some more, because last time I was there, I think I had about 8 hours to look through the scrapbooks, and I need more time just to look at them some more. And I think I'm probably going to go there once the book comes out to have another look.
Yeah. Let's go back to the start of the narrative. My question...
This one?
Or before. Yeah. My question to you is, personally, these sort of scrapbooks and the ideas that come across here, and the idea that these are women of the time coming and putting their own words into, the materials that have been, given to them or put onto them by these advertisements and stuff. For you, what does that mean? What is that connection? Do you feel a connection there between, modern activities and modern ways of, expression? And what importance do you think that these scrapbooks hold for the progression into where we're at now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this scrapbook from the 1880s, is right before the suffrage movement really got going in a major way, leading to women's suffrage in the early 20th century, like 1919. So it's like right when women were just starting to question in a deep and systematic way their oppression, their inability to go to the university, except for a very small number of women, their inability to enter the professions, to be in charge of their own destiny, and most importantly, to vote. So to me, this is such a crystallizing moment in women's history, which is why it's so lovely to see her sort of take on kind of these very conventional views of what it means to be a woman, and deeply kind of like laughing at them. To me, laughter is a form of resistance. It's like one of the most powerful forms of resistance that there is. So I love that. And of course, as I often say to my students, there is nothing in 21st century that didn't get its start in the 19th century. I mean, you name it. It all got started there. Film, photography, computers. I mean, I could go on and on and on, So to me, it's so helpful to kind of look back to see where all of this got started. And of course, our visual media now, advertising media is like beyond anything they could have imagined during the Victorian period. Product placement, I mean, things like that got started in the Victorian period, but they really come to into flower during our own. So the kind of critical thinking that this facsimile edition, when it's published, will provide, I think, will give us tools to analyze our own print culture now. The way I teach literature is always partly about visual culture, because I love art and I love crafts, kind of popular arts. So to me, it also kind of connects to where I am as a teacher. I mean, I definitely plan to use this as a textbook once it's printed. That's one of the reasons I thought it should go from being a one-off individual work of art to a facsimile edition, is because then a larger number of people could engage with it and really trace our own critical thinking about mass media to an earlier time period.
And that facsimile will be coming out soon.
Well, I just, because I knew I was going to do this interview, I contacted the publisher, and they said probably like February, March. So I'm really excited about it, because there have been some facsimile editions of scrapbooks, but not for quite some time. So I think it's time, and there's a lot of people interested in this research. By the way, I'm a British literature scholar, but there are tons of American scrapbooks too. So if anyone's interested, I can point you to lots of collections in the United States that are just as rich and just as interesting, including some abolition-era scrapbooks that are absolutely fascinating, that Ellen Gruber-Garvey has studied, one of my colleagues at another university. So interesting.
Yeah, that should be really, really interesting to read once it comes out.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Alexis Easley. To learn more about their work, You can find them on the Sorry, let me do that one again. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Easley. To learn more about her work, you can find them on the St. Paul campus of the University of St. Thomas. The Professor Podcast is brought to you by the St. Thomas Libraries and made possible by funding from the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm your host, Owen Larson, graduating in 2024. The producers and library staff are Marie Davidson, Andrea... Oh boy. Oh boy. I'm sorry.
No worries. You can always do retakes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Easley. To learn more about her work, you can find her on the St. Paul campus of the University of St. Thomas. The Professor Podcast is brought to you by the St. Thomas Libraries and made possible with funding from the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm your host, Owen Larson. The producers and library staff are Marie Davidson, Andrea Cope, and Trent Brager. Thank you so much for our guests and to you, our listeners.